The bitter wind of late December 1776 cut through the ragged Continental Army like a blade through worn canvas. General George Washington stood at the edge of the Delaware River, his weathered face etched with the weight of a dying revolution. Behind him, fewer than 2,400 men huddled around smoking campfires, their feet wrapped in bloody rags, leaving crimson trails in the snow that told the story of their retreat from New York. The Continental Army was hemorrhaging soldiers faster than battlefield wounds could claim them. Enlistments were set to expire on December 31st, and Washington knew that come New Year's Day, he might command nothing more than a handful of officers and the bitter memory of independence. The British controlled New York, Rhode Island, and much of New Jersey. Loyalist sentiment was swelling like a spring tide, and even stalwart patriots whispered that perhaps reconciliation with King George III might be preferable to this endless, seemingly hopeless struggle. Major James Wilkinson later wrote in his memoirs that the army resembled a collection of scarecrows rather than soldiers. Yet something burned in Washington's eyes that December morning that spoke of desperate resolve rather than defeat. The general had received intelligence that Colonel Johann Rall commanded approximately 1,400 Hessian troops in Trenton, celebrating Christmas with Germanic thoroughness and winter quarter complacency. Thomas Paine's words from the crisis echoed in the minds of those who could read. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. Washington understood that, unless he could deliver a victory, any victory, the revolution would die not from British bayonets, but from American despair. The plan that crystallized in Washington's mind was audacious to the point of madness. Cross the ice-choked Delaware River on Christmas night, march 9 miles through a blizzard, and attack Trenton at dawn. It was the kind of desperate gamble that only a man with nothing left to lose would contemplate. His officers, hardened veterans like Nathanael Greene and John Sullivan, listened to the proposal with the grim attention of men preparing for what might be their final battle. As December 25th dawned cold and gray, Washington began moving his pieces into position like a chess master playing for his very survival. The boats, flat-bottomed Durham boats, typically used for hauling iron, or were commandeered and positioned along the Pennsylvania shore. Artillery pieces, including the precious 18 cannons under Captain Alexander Hamilton's command, were carefully prepared for transport across the treacherous river. The Continental Army's situation was so desperate that even their enemies had begun to relax their vigilance. British General William Howe had established comfortable winter quarters in New York, confident that the rebellion would collapse under its own weight before spring. The Hessian mercenaries in Trenton, far from their homeland and weary of American warfare, settled into their quarters with the satisfaction of professional soldiers who believed their work nearly done. But Washington possessed something his enemies had consistently underestimated: the ability to inspire broken men to attempt the impossible. As Christmas evening approached and the first snowflakes began to fall, he prepared to stake everything on a single, audacious throw of the dice that would either resurrect the revolution or bury it forever in the frozen fields of New Jersey. The ice-laden Delaware River stretched before them like a barrier between hope and despair. As Washington's army began their legendary crossing on the night of December 25th, 1776, Captain John Fitzgerald, serving as Washington's aide-de-camp, would later describe the scene as Danny's vision transported to the banks of a frozen American river, where men moved like shadows against the pale ice, their breath forming clouds in the bitter air. The password for the night was victory or death, words that carried more weight than mere military protocol. Every man crossing that river understood they were participants in what might be the revolution's final act. The boats, manned by Colonel John Glover's Marblehead mariners, cut through chunks of ice with the steady rhythm of men who had made their living from the sea. These Massachusetts fishermen possessed the nautical skills that transformed Washington's desperate gamble from impossible to merely improbable. As documented in David Hackett Fisher's comprehensive study, Washington's Crossing, the operation required 3 separate crossings to transport the entire force, their equipment, and 18 pieces of artillery across the treacherous river. The storm that had seemed like another obstacle proved to be divine providence, masking the sound of their movement and preventing Hessian patrols from detecting the approaching Continental forces. Lieutenant James Monroe, who would one day become America's 5th president, crossed that night as an 18-year-old officer in Captain William Washington's company. He later recalled how the snow seemed to muffle not just sound, but time itself, creating an otherworldly atmosphere where past and future converged in a single moment of shared purpose. The young men crossing the Delaware carried with them the hopes of a continent, though most were to focus on not freezing to death to contemplate such grand abstractions. The crossing took longer than anticipated. Washington had planned to begin the assault on Trenton at dawn, but logistical challenges and the brutal weather delayed their departure from the Pennsylvania shore until well after dark. By the time the last artillery piece reached the New Jersey side, it was nearly 3 in the morning of December 26th. The general faced a cruel choice: abort the mission and return to Pennsylvania, or continue with a daylight assault that would sacrifice the element of surprise. Washington chose to press forward, understanding that retreat meant certain dissolution of his army. The march from Johnson's Ferry to Trenton covered 9 miles of ice-covered roads that tested every man's endurance. Private John Greenwood, a fifer in the Continental Army, described how soldiers wrapped their feet in whatever cloth they could find, leaving bloody tracks in the snow that marked their passage like breadcrumbs in a fairy tale. The army split into 2 columns as they approached Trenton. General Nathanael Greene commanded the northern route along the Pennington Road, while General John Sullivan took the southern approach via River Road. This pincer movement would prevent Hessian escape while maximizing the shock effect of a coordinated assault. Artillery under Captain Alexander Hamilton and Captain Thomas Forrest accompanied each column, their cannons representing the Revolution's most precious military assets. As dawn broke gray and cold over Trenton, Washington's gamble approached its moment of truth. The Hessian garrison, commanded by Colonel Johann Rall, remained largely unaware that 2,400 Continental soldiers were positioning themselves around their winter quarters. The stage was set for a battle that would either breathe new life into the dying Revolution or deliver its final blow. In the growing light of December 26, 1776, the fate of American independence hung in the balance like morning mist over the Delaware, waiting for the first cannon shot to determine whether it would rise toward heaven or dissipate into historical footnote. The first cannon shot shattered the morning silence at precisely 8 o'clock on December 26, 1776, announcing to the sleeping town of Trenton that the American Revolution had found its voice again. Captain Alexander Hamilton's battery, positioned at the head of King Street, unleashed a thunderous barrage that sent Hessian soldiers stumbling from their quarters. In various states of undress, their Christmas celebrations abruptly transformed into a nightmare of smoke and screaming iron. Colonel Johann Rall, the Hessian commander, had dismissed warnings from his own officers about potential American activity. Captain Andreas Wiederholt had reported suspicious movements the previous evening, but Rall, perhaps influenced by holiday festivities, had waved away such concerns with the confidence of a professional soldier who believed his enemies incapable of significant action. This fatal miscalculation would cost him not only the battle, but his life within the hour. The Continental Army's attack unfolded with precision that belied their ragged appearance. General Nathanael Greene's northern column swept down the Pennington Road while General John Sullivan's southern force advanced along River Road, creating the pincer movement Washington had envisioned. The surprise was so complete that many Hessians initially believed they were under attack from local militiamen, rather than the Continental Army they assumed was dying in Pennsylvania. Private John Greenwood, fighting with Sullivan's column, later described the scene as organized chaos blessed by Providence. Hessian soldiers, trained in European warfare, where battles followed predictable patterns, struggled to adapt to the Americans' unconventional assault. Streets became deadly corridors as Continental forces poured musket fire from buildings and alleys, while artillery commanded every major intersection with devastating effect. According to military historian William Stryker's detailed account, in the battles of Trenton and Princeton, the fighting reached its climax when Colonel Rall attempted to organize a counterattack near the Trenton barracks. Leading from the front in the tradition of Prussian officers, Rall rallied approximately 100 men for a desperate charge up King Street, directly into the muzzles of Hamilton's cannons. The volley that followed ended Hessian resistance and mortally wounded their commander, who fell pierced by 2 musket balls. The battle's outcome became inevitable once Rall fell and Hessian organization collapsed. Major Friedrich von Dechow attempted to maintain resistance at the southern end of town, but Sullivan's forces had already seized the bridge over a Sunpink Creek, cutting off the primary escape route. Hessian soldiers found themselves trapped In a killing ground with Continental forces controlling every exit and artillery pieces commanding every street, the surrender came swiftly once organized resistance crumbled. Lieutenant Peel, assuming command after Rawls' wounding, recognized the hopelessness of continued fighting and ordered his men to lay down their arms. In less than 2 hours, Washington had accomplished what seemed impossible just 12 hours earlier, a complete tactical victory that netted nearly 1,000 prisoners, including 30 officers, while suffering minimal casualties. The immediate aftermath proved as significant as the battle itself. Washington's army, energized by their first major victory in months, began to shed the demoralized appearance that had characterized their retreat from New York. Captured Hessian supplies muskets, ammunition, food, and badly needed clothing provided material relief, but the psychological transformation was even more profound. These same men, who had crossed the Delaware as the remnants of a dying cause, now stood as victors on New Jersey soil. News of Trenton's capture spread through the colonies like wildfire, rekindling patriot enthusiasm that had nearly flickered out during the dark days of December. But Washington understood that one victory, however dramatic, could not sustain a revolution. The real test would come in the days ahead, when British forces would inevitably counterattack with overwhelming force, seeking to crush this resurgent American threat before it could grow into something truly dangerous to British rule in North America. The euphoria of victory at Trenton lasted exactly 48 hours before reality reasserted itself, with the arrival of British reinforcements under General Charles Cornwallis. By December 28, 1776, Washington faced a new crisis that threatened to transform his brilliant triumph into a costly trap. Intelligence reports indicated that Cornwallis was advancing from New York with approximately 8,000 veteran troops, intent on crushing the Continental Army before it could escape back across the Delaware. Washington's position had become precarious despite his recent success. The captured Hessian supplies had provided temporary relief, but his army remained woefully outnumbered and inadequately equipped for sustained combat against British regulars. More critically, enlistments for many Continental soldiers were still set to expire on December 31st, meaning that even his current modest force might evaporate within days. Regardless of British military action, the general made a decision that revealed both his strategic genius and his willingness to embrace calculated risk. Rather than retreat to Pennsylvania as his officers expected, Washington chose to remain on the New Jersey side of the Delaware, occupying Trenton and challenging the British to dislodge him. This audacious stance served multiple purposes. It maintained revolutionary momentum, protected patriot civilians in western New Jersey, and potentially drew British forces into a winter campaign they preferred to avoid. General Hugh Mercer, commanding advance units south of Trenton, reported Cornwallis's approach on January 1st, 1777. The British general, his reputation stung by the Hessian defeat, had abandoned comfortable winter quarters in New York to personally oversee what he assumed would be a routine suppression of colonial insurgents. Contemporary accounts from British officers suggest Cornwallis viewed the campaign as an opportunity to restore professional military reputation, damaged by Washington's Christmas surprise. As documented in John Buchanan's The Road to Guilford Courthouse, the British advance proceeded with methodical efficiency that reflected professional military training. Cornwallis deployed light infantry as skirmishers, positioned artillery to command key terrain, and maintained disciplined formations that testified 2 years of European battlefield experience. His confidence seemed justified given the disparity in numbers, training, and equipment between his forces and Washington's Continental Army. The first serious engagement occurred at the Assunpink Creek on January 2nd, where Washington had positioned his army behind the natural barrier that ran along Trenton's southern edge. British probing attacks throughout the afternoon tested American defenses, while Cornwallis positioned his main force for what he planned as a decisive assault the following morning. The creek, swollen by winter rains and partially frozen, created a formidable obstacle that channeled any British attack into predictable avenues. Captain Thomas Rodney of the Delaware Militia described the day's fighting as a chess match played with muskets and cannon, where both commanders maneuvered for advantageous positions. While avoiding decisive engagement, Washington deployed his artillery, including the captured Hessian guns from Trenton, along the creek's northern bank, creating overlapping fields of fire that would devastate any British attempt to force a crossing. As darkness fell on January 2nd, Cornwallis made a decision that would haunt British strategy for the remainder of the war. Confident that Washington was trapped against the Delaware River with no escape route, except retreat to Pennsylvania, the British general chose to postpone his assault until morning, believing that daylight would facilitate a more complete destruction of American forces. "We'll bag the old fox in the morning," Cornwallis reportedly told his officers, a phrase that would become synonymous with military overconfidence. But Washington was already planning another of his signature moves, a night march that would again confound British expectations and transform apparent defeat into unexpected opportunity. The old fox had no intention of waiting meekly for Cornwallis to spring his trap. Instead, he was preparing to demonstrate once more that unconventional warfare, properly executed, could neutralize conventional military advantages and turn the hunter into the hunted. As Cornwallis settled into comfortable quarters in Trenton, confident that morning would bring the final destruction of Washington's Continental Army, the American commander was orchestrating one of military history's most audacious escapes. The night of January 2nd to 3rd, 1777, witnessed what would become known as Washington's Ghost March, a movement so perfectly executed that British forces would wait to find their quarry had vanished like morning mist, leaving only cold campfires and the echo of wheels on frozen ground. The plan Washington conceived required precision, stealth, and fortune in equal measure. Rather than retreat across the Delaware as Cornwallis expected, the Continental Army would slip around the British left flank via the Quaker Road, a little-used route that curved northeast toward Princeton. This maneuver would place American forces behind British lines while potentially capturing the strategic crossroads town that controlled communications between New York and Philadelphia. Preparation for the march began at midnight with measures designed to deceive British sentries positioned along the Sunpink Creek. Continental soldiers left campfires burning and detailed small parties to maintain the sounds of normal camp activity, chopping wood, calling challenges, and moving about in patterns that suggested a full army in winter quarters. Meanwhile, the main force began their silent exodus along roads made treacherous by ice and recent snow. The artillery presented the greatest challenge to maintaining stealth. Captain Alexander Hamilton's battery and other gun crews wrapped wheels in cloth and packed cannon barrels with rags to muffle the distinctive sounds of moving ordnance. Horses' hooves were similarly muffled, while soldiers were ordered to maintain absolute silence under penalty of death. The entire army moved like a specter through the New Jersey night, leaving behind the trap Cornwallis had so carefully prepared. According to David Hackett Fisher's research in Washington's Crossing, the march covered approximately 12 miles of difficult terrain in sub-freezing temperatures. Men who had been fighting intermittently for a week pressed forward through exhaustion that bordered on collapse, sustained by the knowledge that capture meant death or imprisonment in the notorious British prison ships anchored in New York Harbor. The Revolution's survival depended on their ability to place one frozen foot in front of the other. Through the longest night of their lives, the first light of January 3rd revealed American forces approaching Princeton from an unexpected direction, having successfully executed what military historians would later compare to Hannibal's crossing of the Alps in terms of strategic audacity. The town housed approximately 600 British troops under Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mawhood, who had been preparing to march south and join Cornwallis's assault on Trenton. When Washington's army materialized from the morning mist like an avenging ghost, the initial contact occurred near the Quaker Meeting House when American advance forces under General Hugh Mercer encountered British light infantry conducting reconnaissance. The ensuing skirmish would escalate rapidly into a full battle, as both sides committed additional troops, transforming what began as a chance encounter into a pivotal engagement that would determine whether Washington's brilliant night march would end in triumph or disaster. Private John Howland, marching with the Rhode Island militia, later described the moment when Princeton's church bells began ringing in alarm. "We knew then that our secret was discovered and that we must fight our way through or perish in the attempt." The element of surprise, so carefully preserved during the night march, was about to be tested in the crucible of combat as to armies that had not expected to meet prepared to battle for control of Princeton and, ultimately, the future of American independence. The Battle of Princeton erupted with the sudden violence of a thunderstorm on the morning of January 3rd, 1777, as General Hugh Mercer's advance guard collided with British light infantry near William Clark's orchard. The encounter began as a meeting engagement, neither side fully prepared for battle. but rapidly escalated as both commanders committed additional forces to what each recognized as a potentially decisive action. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mawhood, commanding the British garrison, possessed the tactical advantage of interior lines and familiar terrain, but Washington's army carried the momentum of men who had already achieved the impossible. Once in the past week, the initial exchange of musket fire quickly became a desperate struggle for control of the high ground near the Quaker Meeting House, where elevation would provide the decisive advantage. In 18th century combat, General Mercer, the Scottish-born physician-turned-soldier, led his men forward with the aggressive spirit that had characterized Continental forces throughout the Princeton campaign. However, British training and discipline began to assert themselves as Mawhood's regulars formed line and delivered coordinated volleys that staggered the American advance. The sound of Brown Bess muskets firing in unison created the distinctive rolling thunder that marked professional European-style warfare. The battle's critical moment arrived when General Mercer fell, mortally wounded by British bayonets during a savage melee near Clark's Orchard, as documented in William Stryker's The Battles of Trenton and Princeton. Mercer's death threatened to break American morale just as the assault reached its crucial phase. Continental soldiers, seeing their beloved commander fall, began to waver under the disciplined British counterattack that followed Mawhood's successful defensive stand. Washington himself arrived at this moment of crisis, riding directly into musket range to rally his faltering troops. Captain John Fitzgerald, serving as the general's aide, later wrote that Washington's appearance on the battlefield transformed the engagement's entire character. The sight of their commander calmly directing the assault, while British bullets whispered past his head, inspired Continental soldiers to reform their lines and resume the attack with renewed determination. The tide turned when Captain Alexander Hamilton's artillery came into action, unlimbering at point-blank range and delivering devastating canister shots that shattered British formations. The combination of artillery fire and renewed infantry assault proved too much for Mawhood's outnumbered garrison. British resistance, so effective during the initial phases of combat, began to crumble under the sustained American pressure. Lieutenant Peel, one of the Hessian officers captured at Trenton but present at Princeton as an observer, described the moment when British lines broke. The rebels fought with a desperation I had not witnessed before, as if the very survival of their cause depended upon this single action. Indeed, Washington understood that Princeton represented far more than a tactical objective. It was proof that the Continental Army could meet British regulars in open battle and emerge victorious. The British retreat quickly became a rout as Continental forces pursued fleeing enemies through Princeton streets. Mawhood, attempting to maintain some semblance of military order, rallied approximately 100 men for a final stand near Nassau Hall, the imposing stone building that housed the College of New Jersey. However, Hamilton's artillery, positioned in the college yard, ended this last resistance with a few well-placed shots that convinced the remaining British soldiers to surrender. The capture of Princeton completed Washington's remarkable week-long campaign that had transformed the American Revolution's prospects from desperate to hopeful. In 7 days, the Continental Army had crossed the Delaware, captured Trenton, evaded British retaliation, and seized Princeton, all while operating in winter conditions that should have made military campaigning impossible. More importantly, Washington had demonstrated that American forces could not only survive British military pressure, but could take the offensive and achieve decisive results against professional European armies. The morning mist that lifted from Princeton's frozen streets on January 3, 1777, revealed more than the aftermath of another American victory. It exposed the fundamental transformation of a revolution that had discovered its capacity to wage successful war against the world's most powerful military force. As Washington surveyed the battlefield where British resistance had finally collapsed, he understood that the week's events had created something unprecedented in colonial American experience, proof that independence was militarily achievable. The immediate tactical results of Princeton were impressive enough. Washington's forces had captured nearly 300 British prisoners, substantial quantities of military supplies, and control of central New Jersey's most important crossroads. More significantly, the Continental Army had defeated British regulars in open battle, dispelling the myth of European military invincibility that had haunted American confidence. Since the war's beginning, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mawhood's garrison, trained and equipped according to the finest military traditions, had been outfought and outmaneuvered by an army that British leaders had dismissed as armed rabble. The strategic implications extended far beyond battlefield mathematics. Lord George Germain, Britain's Secretary of State for the Colonies, would later acknowledge that Princeton marked the moment when suppressing the American rebellion transformed from a police action into a genuine war requiring full military commitment. British forces could no longer assume that colonial resistance would collapse under professional military pressure, nor could they maintain the comfortable winter quarters that European warfare traditionally provided. Contemporary accounts from British officers reveal the profound psychological impact of Washington's twin victories. Captain William Bamfylde, writing to his family in England, described how Princeton had given the rebels a confidence they never possessed before, while casting doubt upon British arms that no previous colonial reverse had achieved. The assumption of inherent military superiority that had sustained British strategy since 1775 was shattered in the space of 8 days. The Revolution's international prospects were equally transformed by the Princeton campaign. French observers, led by the Comte de Vergennes, had been monitoring American military performance as a measure of whether colonial independence might serve French strategic interests against Britain. According to diplomatic correspondence preserved in the French Foreign Ministry archives, Princeton provided the first evidence that American forces possessed the military capability necessary to sustain a prolonged conflict that would drain British resources and potentially create opportunities for French intervention within the colonies themselves. Princeton's impact rippled outward like concentric circles from a stone dropped in still water. Patriot morale, which had reached its nadir during the December retreats, experienced a resurrection that recruitment officers described as miraculous. Men who had considered the cause lost began appearing at Continental Army camps, while militia units that had dissolved after the New York defeats began reforming under local leaders. Inspired by Washington's example, the campaign's most profound effect may have been on Washington himself, who emerged from the week's trials with enhanced authority and strategic confidence that would sustain him through the war's remaining challenges. The general, who had crossed the Delaware as commander of a dying cause, now stood as the acknowledged leader of a viable independence movement, capable of defeating British arms. This transformation of Washington from desperate gambler to victorious commander would prove essential to maintaining American resistance through the dark years that lay ahead. As spring approached and both armies prepared for renewed campaigning, the battles of Trenton and Princeton had established the American Revolution's fundamental character. No longer could the conflict be dismissed as a temporary colonial uprising destined to collapse under British pressure. Washington had proven that American independence possessed both the military means and strategic vision necessary to challenge British rule successfully. The thunder that had echoed across New Jersey's frozen fields on those January mornings would continue reverberating until it finally silenced the guns at Yorktown, where Lord Cornwallis, the same general who had once boasted of bagging Washington like a fox, would surrender his sword to the commander he had so consistently underestimated. The Revolution that had nearly died in December 1776 was reborn in the crucible of Princeton, transformed from desperate rebellion into a war of independence that would reshape the Atlantic world and establish the United States of America as history's first successful colonial independence movement.